so we can go ahead and get started.
All right.
So this week is the dosages, and the whole month of February is going to be strength and conditioning topics. But that's not from a strength and conditioning background. That's not from their perspective. That's from an athletic training background still. So with the athletic training responsibilities in mind, how do we apply the dosages? So the kind of overview, there's a lot to cover here, and so we'll try to get through all of it, at least in some degree of detail. If you want to stop and focus on anything, discuss anything, debate anything, just let me know.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, the overview, so the variables that you can play around with in terms of the dosage would be the volume, the intensity, the tempo, context, depending on when it is during the day, when it is during the season, and then the individual, how they respond to the different dosages. So not just prescribing the perfect program, but then also being flexible with how that individual responds. So for the volume, there's a few different ways that you can measure it, and the sets is probably the most commonly discussed of how many sets per day or per workout, or sometimes they talk about how many sets per week per muscle group. And the research is all over the place with those different things. The latest trends in strength work is how many sets per week per muscle group is leading to. Typically, it's in the bodybuilding community, so that would be for muscle hypertrophy, and that's not always what we're targeting. So I'm sure you've seen in some of your rehabs, you're not just trying to make the muscle bigger. You're not just trying to get for example, the paper talked a lot about the ACL. You're not just trying to make the quads bigger, but you're trying to get them stronger or more powerful so that they can be functional athletes. So the muscle group, or the research around the sets per week per muscle group, is still a little bit sparse in terms of the athletic training application, but we can kind of steal the information from the strength and conditioning world and then apply it in a medical context. And then the reps, there's typically rep schemes, and that's kind of what you see in the chart over here on the right. Is the yellow portion is the best for that rep range down at the bottom. The yellow portion is what is emphasized the most, and people will get really deep into the woods about, well, 4 reps instead of 6, or 8 reps instead of 10, or what's the perfect amount of reps per set. And there's no real magical answer.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was an undergrad, we had our clinical coordinator was really big into it. And there was a paper that I tried to find for this presentation, but couldn't find. And it was talking about the magic of 3 sets of 10, right? Like that's all we learned in undergrad is 3 sets of 10 for glutes, 3 sets of 10 for the quads, 3 sets of 10 for the hamstrings. Make sure that you get your 3 sets of 10 in for every muscle group, right? And the evidence for that is a lot more nuanced than what the textbook would seem. So it's not just at 6 reps, it becomes hypertrophy, or anything below 6 reps is only strength or only power, and anything above 12 reps is only muscular endurance. That's not the right way. And the chart really describes it pretty accurately. You get for the rep ranges, you're going to get a little bit of strength, a little bit of power in that kind of 6 to 12 rep range. You're going to get a little bit of muscular endurance, but you're not going to get a ton for that rep range. So if you're trying to target power, you want to keep it in a relatively low rep scheme. So that's typically in the 1 to 3. And then the intensity has to be relatively high. So if you're just doing 1 or 2 reps of a really light weight, you're never going to get any stronger. You're never going to get any more powerful. So the weight, the intensity has to match the rep prescription. And that's an important concept to take forward. And then same goes for like muscular endurance. You don't only build it in the 13 to 20 range. You're going to build some muscular endurance, some capacity in that 6 to 12 rep range, but you're not going to get a ton if you're only doing 2 reps with the lighter weight. So like I said, that chart gives you kind of a rough guide of how to maximize your training, but it's not a perfect science where each and everybody who you're working with is going to respond exactly the same to the exact rep scheme that is corresponding with strength, power, hypertrophy, or muscular endurance. Then the frequency, the amount of reps per, or the number of training sessions per week. And then also you can add those up to the training block. And then also you need to periodize your rest. So depending on where they are in that rehab process, do you want them to do 1 day of rehab and then an off day and then kind of see how the body responds? Are you waiting for that inflammatory response to the acute kind of insult that we've added? Or do you want to try to build a little bit more resilience and you want to put 2 days, 3 days, 4 days back to back? Whatever your goal is in terms of what you're trying to get them back to do is really what you want to align your rehab. But you might have to start with a 1-to-1 ratio and you do 1 day on, 1 day off, and then you're building. So as they respond well to that, then you can start to put in, okay, let's see if we can get them to do 2 days without causing too much soreness or too much pain that next day. And then they get that third day would be the rest day. So you can kind of play around with all those different variables. Any questions, thoughts so far?
Kind of random question.
Yeah, what's up?
How relevant is the FIT principle still? I feel like, is that like kind of just played out, or is it still like relevant within like making exercise programs?
The what principle? Sorry?
The FIT principle, like frequency, intensity, time, type.
Yeah, so we'll get into that.
Okay.
I think that it depends on your application of it. Like you can either say it's the most important thing or it's not important at all. The variables that you're playing with, that kind of stuff all matters. The frequency, like I said in here, matters. The intensity we'll talk about on the next slide, I believe. And then what would you say T was?
Time and type.
Yeah. So in terms of contraction type, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then the time would probably be time under tension. So going back to this first slide, you'll see the intensity in the next slide, and then the tempo is something we'll touch on as well. But then contraction type is actually discussed a little bit more within the paper. So then we'll break that down once we get to the paper portion. So in terms of the intensity, and this is along with what you were saying, the way that I think about it is you can only really change a couple of variables to change the body's response. So if you think about the energy systems, and this is how the body reacts to the different training stimuli. So if it's a really short duration of activity, less than 30 seconds, you're probably going to be using that ATP PC energy system. So that system produces a ton of energy really quickly, but it's not good for endurance. So that's the anaerobic exercise, for example. If you go out and you have somebody sprint, right? And then that eventually it's not a perfect like system where at 30 seconds the next system kicks on, and then at minute 30 then the following system kicks on. It's not like a start stop and then a transition to the next system, but they have gaining or losing contributions of energy to the exercise. So if you look at, for example, like right at that 30-second mark, you're getting energy contributions from all of the different types of energy sources. You can play around with how the body is skewed, whether it's more towards that immediate energy system or more toward that short-term energy system or more toward that long-term energy system. But you're never going to have a total isolation of just immediate energy, ATP, PC, or just aerobic, oxidative, or glycolytic capacities. So that being said, you can skew them to the training adaptation for 10 to 30 seconds, 30 seconds to a minute, or 2 minutes plus. And if you're doing that, then their force is either going to, most likely your force is going to drop off. So thinking about how you want to program somebody's gym or rehab based on the force. So you know that force is going to drop off over time. Well, how much time do you want them to be working before that force drops off? So if you're trying to target that ATPP system, say you have like a track and field sprinter who is doing the 100-meter and the 200-meter sprint. They never need to work more than 30 seconds. So it's kind of pointless to be training their long-term energy system with aerobic activity, right? You're only going to detrain their sprint capacity if you do it that way. So I want them to be working in the gym for very short periods of time. And in order to challenge the muscles adequately in that short period of time, you have to have the forces very high. So that can be done via either really high speeds or really heavy weights. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
So the variable that I'm most interested in is always going to be force. and depending on where they are, like if they're on a track, for example, it's very difficult to measure how much force they're putting through the ground with each and every step. But relatively like how much each, actually I just saw a really good post on this the other day, I can send it to you. The how much each muscle group is going to experience in terms of force relative to the body weight. So for example, they said like the hip flexors are going to see, I think it was somewhere between 6 and 8 times the body weight. The calf is going to see somewhere between like 4 to 6 times body weight. You're going to see these incredibly high forces, versus if you have somebody go out and walk or jog, maybe it's like 1 or 2 times the body weight forces when they have that highest impact. So I'm paying attention to the force, but then also like considering the context of how they're applying that force. So if that's a sprinter, I want them to sprint because that produces really high forces with context to running. I also want them to be doing high forces in the gym, but it's a little bit harder to get that translation because they're going to be moving really slow with heavy weight. So think about if you put 400 pounds on your back right now, right? How fast is that bar going to go back up after you get to the bottom of your squat?
Not very high, not very fast at all.
Really, really slow, right? So the concept is that's still a really heavy force because you've got so much weight on your back. And so force can be measured via newtons most commonly, but can also be translated to kilograms or pounds. And that's how it's put into kind of context of how many times body weight force they're experiencing. So for example, if you weigh 100 pounds and you're squatting 300 pounds, even at rest, you're experiencing 400 or 4 times body weight because you've got all that weight on your back. But if you then get to the bottom of the squat, you've got that downward momentum of the weight, and then it presses even harder into you because it's got momentum. Then you try to go up and resist it, and now maybe you're experiencing 5 or 6 times body weight via that force on your back. So that's how weight kind of influences the force application. But again, the goal is apply as much force as they need to or as they can, and then you're applying it in the context of, well, how long is their working event? So for example, an American football player probably needs to hang out in that same short-term energy system, but maybe you have a cross-country runner who needs to be doing longer-term energy system training, and so maybe you're going a little bit lighter weight with them, still heavy, as much weight as they can tolerate, but you're doing it for 2 minutes instead of 30 seconds. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then that's where the other kind of measures or metrics come into play in terms of how much work they're actually doing. So the difficulty, RPE, pretty much everybody's familiar with, but that's the rating of perceived exertion. The scales can vary there. Most people do 1 to 10 because it's easy, but the technical term or the technical scale was 6 to 20. A bit harder in terms of application to athletes because then they have too many options to choose from and they can never pick an easy number to say what their RPE is. So most people go 1 to 10 there, and then RIR is reps in reserve. So if you ask somebody, okay, you just did 12 reps of bench press, how many more reps do you think you could do? If the answer is 5, then their reps in reserve would be 5. If their answer is 2, then their RIR is 2. So you can measure how close somebody is to like muscular failure, which is an important training concept in the bodybuilding world or in the strength and conditioning world. But it's also important in terms of rehab, because I think this is something ATs rarely consider, is how close you're actually getting somebody to failure. So for example, if you have somebody do TheraBand clamshells, is a really common exercise, right? How many reps do you think right now you could put a TheraBand around your hips or around your knees and just do clamshells? How many reps do you think you could get to?
Straight, probably like 30, 35, maybe.
Right. So if I took you and I said, let's do 3 sets of 10, at the end of 10, you've got another 20 at minimum. I would argue you could probably get to like 100. It would hurt. It would burn. You wouldn't like it. But I think you could get to like 100 reps, no problem. Yeah. So with TheraBands, you never really get that close to failure. Your RIR is always going to be really high. So in terms of the application of the intensity, that's always going to be a really low intensity. So therabands are a good introductory exercise, but they're a really poor end stage exercise. If you've got somebody who's almost cleared to return to sport and you're still doing therabands with them, you've got serious problems. And then the other thing is the 1 rep max conversion. I'm sure you've seen these before. I know you're in the gym a lot, but the conversion charts, these can be provided by different sources. I know the NSCA has one, but the idea is that you're taking however much you could theoretically max out at, and you're then going to do a percentage of that in your training. So for example, if you're going to do 10 reps, it's probably something 50 to 60% of your 1 rep max. If you can squat 300 pounds, then you're going to train probably 150 to maybe 180, for example. And that gives you kind of your relative difficulty for that set. And then obviously you're playing around with that, trying to get them closer to or a higher RPE or a lower RIR, because you're trying to push the muscular adaptations there. And then the time. So this is the energy system component. The duration of the exercise will influence which energy system is going to be utilized the most. And this kind of tells you how the muscles are going to adapt. So if you put somebody through consistent aerobic training, their body's going to get better at aerobic activity. If you put somebody through anaerobic activity, their body's going to get better at anaerobic activity. And that's the SAID principle that's commonly discussed in strength and conditioning, specific adaptations to impose demands. So the body gets better at pretty much anything that you tell it to do. And this can also be measured in terms of distance. Obviously, if you're moving a weight, say a sled, if you're going to push it 10 yards versus 30 yards, then you know that's going to take you 3 times as long to move it. So you can convert it to the time if you prefer, or you can just say, if I'm working for 30 yards and that's only taking me 30 seconds, then I know I'm still working that shorter term energy system. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
Questions? If I started to answer the fit principle that you talked about?
Yes.
Cool. We'll keep going through it because there's more to it, but this is probably a little bit more of what you were talking about or asking about, was the tempo and the time under tension. So you can do different contraction types, obviously, that are going to influence the time under tension. And there's a really good video that I linked to on, I think it's the next slide, but RP Hypertrophy, 1, is a really good channel. And 2, they have a really good website that has a lot of helpful information. So check them out if you haven't already. But the time under tension. So for example, if I do 10 reps and I'm only taking 1 second to get it down to the bottom and 1 second up to the top, that would be 2 seconds of tension roughly per set or per rep. So if I do 10 reps, then that's 20 seconds under tension, right? So if I slow that down now and I do 5 seconds to get down to the bottom and 1 second back up, now we're at 6 seconds per rep. Multiply that out by 10 reps, and now we're at 60 seconds as opposed to 20. That makes sense? So you get a lot more time under tension, and then the body's going to get a lot different adaptation again to the type of training that you're doing. If you're holding if you're eccentrically lowering the weight really slowly, 4, 5, 6 seconds, the body is going to build a lot more muscle in terms of hypertrophy than if you're just dropping that weight onto your chest, or if you're just bouncing down to the bottom of a squat and then coming back up. So depending on what you're trying to train, if you're trying to train, again, that explosive power or that really top range strength, versus if you're trying to build muscle and you're trying to create that muscle hypertrophy, like a lot of times we are. There's some new, pretty cool, like biotech or like hardware for measuring the tempo that you're doing the exercise at. The like VBT is a whole new like research field in and of itself, but there's some cool devices that I've seen. The 2 that come to mind are Output Sports, and then there's another one called Vitruve. And basically they're clips that attach to like the barbell. One is wired and one is wireless. There's pros and cons to each, but the clip on the bar measures how fast the bar is moving. So if you do 10 reps and the first one you're moving at, say, 1 meter per second, And then after 8 reps, you start to slow down. Now you're moving at 8 meters per second, or 0.8 meters per second. And then at your 10th rep, you're really struggling. Maybe now it's moving at half a meter per second. You can use that to imply your training demand. So if you want somebody to push to the point of failure, if that bar is dropped 20%, you know they're getting pretty close to failure. If the bar is dropped 50%, they are probably working as hard as they possibly can. And so that's what this chart shows, is the velocity loss. So if you're trying to keep it pretty light and easy, for example, in an early stage rehab, maybe you only want 5 to 10% of that velocity loss, versus if you have somebody you're trying to push at the end stage, maybe you want them to get really close to failure. So you're pushing them to that 50% velocity loss. So here's the literature review that I think is helpful for the strength and conditioning portion of athletic training. The NSCA is always a good resource. They have a lot more in-depth application of like strength and conditioning principles than NATA ever does. The APTA, this is the physical therapy, they have a separate strength training handout that is also a pretty good resource. And these are all linked, so you can check back and visit these in your own time. And then the measuring the intensity with the movement velocity, there's a paper that I linked to that's really good in terms of talking about the correlation with velocity and intensity. So knowing how intense somebody's really moving based on how fast their weight is moving. The 2 links at the bottom, the RP hypertrophy link is really good. It's about a 20 to 30 minute video of him breaking down the various rep ranges. Again, they're not an exact science of at 3 reps, it becomes strength as opposed to power, or 6 reps becomes hypertrophy instead of strength. There's a little bit of crossover there, and it's going to vary a little bit by the individual as well. And then the second video I linked is the how to read tempo. So if you're programming for tempo specifically and you want somebody to lower the weight at a certain tempo, there's a really good video that breaks down how you can program that or write it out so that your clients or your athletes know what tempo you expect them to be moving at if you're not supervising it. The typical format is going to be 4 numbers separated by dashes, and they represent the various stages of the lift. So the eccentric is typically the first movement. So in a squat, for example, lowering that bar down and getting into that squat position, that would be your first number. So say that number is 2. That would be 2 seconds to get down to the bottom of the lift. Then the next number would be how long you spend at the bottom of the squat. So that could be 1 second, 2 seconds, or it could be 0 if you just want them to get to the bottom and come right back up. Then from there, the amount of time you want them coming back up, typically you will want that to be as fast as possible. But that could be something like a 1 if you want them to do controlled on the way up, or it could be an X if you really want somebody to explode out of the bottom with intent. And then the last piece is the amount of rest they're spending at the top of the squat. That number is typically somewhere in the 2 to 5 range, depending on like the weight and the intensity you're going with. You might need more or less time at the top of the squat. But like I said, RP hypertrophy is a really good video. If you're interested in rep ranges, he breaks down like the pros and cons of each of them and says what it is good for, what it isn't good for, maybe, and then like what it's in the middle for. So really good video. So before I start with the paper, any questions about any of that stuff?
No.
Cool. Cover everything except for, let's see. I think we covered everything in the fit principle, didn't we?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, contraction type. That was the last thing. And the contraction type is in the paper, so we'll get to that. So this week's paper was the multi-system approach to human movement after ACL reconstruction, the musculoskeletal system. And essentially what it is, it's a clinical commentary. So a physical therapist broke down this kind of nuanced language within the physical therapies community. So the American Physical Therapy Association put out this new publication. This was back in like 2013, I think. And they put out this new kind of theory of how to train individuals in response to an injury. And what they were trying to get to is that the movement system integrates so many different systems in the human body. So whether that's neural or bone or muscle, like there's so many different parts that all can influence how an individual is moving, movement quality or force output, return to sport, all of that different stuff. So they put this paper out or this new terminology out to try to better enhance how we're targeting different tissues within a rehab context, whether we're challenging the nervous system adequately, whether we're pushing the joints heavily enough, whether we are training the muscles sufficiently, all of that kind of stuff. So they break down the various components and then they summarize them and say each one of these parts is contributing to the overall movement system, which would be the human body. And then the context is they use post ACL injury or post ACL reconstruction for the rehabilitation portion and what they were measuring. So quote that I wrote down for the definition portion of it, what the APTA said was that the body's ability to generate and maintain movement through integration of all body systems and functions. That was their new definition. And then something that I thought was interesting in terms of the kind of summary by the clinical commentary was the interaction and integration of component systems contributes to success of the system as a whole. So basically what that's saying is if you influence any one system, the muscles, for example, it will also influence the movement system as a whole. So then the musculoskeletal adaptations, this is all pretty typical stuff. You'll see these if you haven't already in your clinical settings. If you work with anybody who has an ACL, most of this stuff is pretty typical. They saw, I want to say it was like 25% of people had greater than 5% or 5-degree knee extension loss. And a lot of people had, actually not as many people had flexion loss, but if you have it, it's a semi-big problem. The most important with an ACL is obviously that knee extension loss. So that caused all kind of complications, the ones that I wrote down from what they had listed. There's a long list, but the arthrofibrosis, the osteoarthritis, the quad inhibition, gait abnormalities, patellofemoral pain syndrome, arthrokinematics, and then also it leads to an increased risk of a revision surgery on the back end. So you really don't want them to have an extension loss. And if you can, you're trying to get that back as soon as possible because it's going to play such a big role in the rest of the rehab. If you can't extend your knee fully and you're getting into these more advanced rehab exercises, for example, if I can't get somebody to stand up at the top of a squat because he's missing 5 degrees, they're going to be pretty off in their movements, especially once they get into higher speed movements like sprinting. The flexion loss was considered to be notable if it was more than 15 degrees. They did note that that was a more significant finding or variable if that individual wants to return to sport. So for a non-athletic population, 15-degree flexion loss is probably not a big deal. They're probably not getting into that really deep squat position very often. They're probably not bending their knee maximally very often throughout their daily living. But for an athlete, for change of direction, there's a lot of implications there if they have more than 15 degrees of knee flexion loss. So the range of motion is important, obviously, to set the tone for the rest of the rehab. Decreased muscle size and strength. So we obviously see quad is the most commonly talked about, but they also reference the hamstring, the hip, and the ankle. And then the donor site has implications in terms of whether or not you're selecting hamstring, bone to patellar tendon bone, or a quad tendon graft. So depending on if you're willing to risk that patellar tendinopathy post-surgery, you can choose the patellar tendon. Typically, athletes aren't going to go with a hamstring, although I have seen some surgeons that prefer it. And then the quad tendon's kind of emerging. It's a lot newer than the other two, but it seems to be a pretty good option with pretty minimal revision surgeries, but then also it has pretty minimal symptom profile. So that's the main advantage, is that they're not getting that anterior knee pain that a lot of patellar tendon grafts will. The one that I found the most interesting out of all of these musculoskeletal adaptations after the ACL was the decreased bone mineral density. And they talked about even like the meniscus matrix changes after the injury. Even if you don't have a damaged meniscus with the ACL tear, you have this matrix that changes the makeup of your meniscus, and it changes the structure of it, how flexible, how pliable it is. And it's pretty interesting to consider, like, especially those subtle movements of like internal and external rotation of the tibia on the femur. The knee has a lot of subtle movements. Obviously, we think of it as just being a hinge joint, but there's a lot of smaller movements that are also taking place. So after an ACL, you're not just worried about that anterior to posterior movement in the extension and flexion. You also have to worry about the decreased bone mineral density of the hip, the femur, the tibia, calcaneus, even they noted. So you get a lot of this kind of offloading of the injured side of the body that I thought was really interesting. But like I said, for the most part, this is all pretty common stuff. We see somebody with quad loss after an ACL and we say, yeah, that happens. The clinical assessment, then you go into the ACL after the surgery, and you're going to see obviously that huge knee effusion. You're going to get a ton of swelling. They're going to be really stiff. They're not going to want to move their knee very much. Their muscle girth is already probably starting to shrink by the time they've had surgery. Their strength is going to drop off. Their rate of force development, their reactive strength, everything is going to go down. But what they talk about in the paper is when you're measuring these different things across the different stages of the rehab. So in terms of priority, the first thing you're going to do is take care of the swelling, right? You're trying to get that the knee to a more normal presentation. From there, you're not going to have swelling or limiting your range of motion, so you can start to work on that. Once you start to get the range of motion back, then you can start to target some of that early muscle strength. And then, like we said earlier, with the intensity, you're probably going to start with a lower intensity, higher rep scheme because of the lower risk of forces that are going to damage either the graft or cause pain, cause kind of a hyper-inflammatory response. So you're going to get all of these things in order. And then at the end stage, you're testing those more functional tests, the hop tests, all of those kind of things. But this is more or less what you should be checking off as you're going through the ACL rehab is if you're doing effective doses, did they get their range of motion back? Did they get their strength back? Did they then work to a higher intensity with faster speeds? Are they then getting that rate of force development? Are they getting reactive strength? So now it's not just how much weight can you move, but how much weight can you absorb, for example, in a change of direction setting. And then can you also perform similar to your opposite leg, your contralateral leg? The different rehab strategies they talked about, and this is I think it was the last paragraph, but it was the progressive overload. So this is pretty basic information, but you're trying to systematically increase the difficulty as you go through the rehab. So that can be changing the number of reps. Maybe you're just increasing the number of reps in your sets. Maybe you're increasing the number of sets in your workout. Maybe you're increasing number of sets in the week or a number of workouts in a week. And then you can get more specific. So if you're trying to get better at, for example, knee extension, then you should probably be doing a lot of knee extension exercises, whether that's an open kinetic chain or a closed kinetic chain. You're doing exercises that are knee extension specific. So, and then the last piece of it would be the variation. So they talked a bit about the periodization, and this gets a lot more in depth than what most ATs ever need, but it is good to kind of know that they exist. So whether it's a linear periodization plan or whether it's an undulating periodization plan, there's all kinds of different strategies for how you're going to kind of plan your high days, your low days. And then they give, I think, like 3 or 4 different ways that they suggest that you go about it. Questions so far? No? Everything makes sense? You got it all?
All sounding good, yeah.
The interventions then, so then they move past the clinical presentation and they talk about the different interventions for muscle strength. So volume and intensity, they followed. This is straight out of the NSCA's like textbook. For strength, you're probably going to want it to be higher than 70% of your 1 rep max. If you're doing anything lower than that, again, if you're training at 40% of your 1 rep max, if you can squat 300 pounds and you're squatting 140 pounds, you can probably do 30 reps of it easy because it's not hard enough and it's not going to drive enough stimulus that your body's going to respond to it. So your intensity needs to be high, probably close to 70% or more of your 1 rep max. And then you're trying to get 10 sets per week. So if you go back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, well, what exercises are common for an ACL? Have you seen an ACL in your clinical rotations yet?
Yes.
Okay. So what exercises are most common? Like what kind of things do you see in those ACL rehabs?
Like first week, like what?
Anywhere, doesn't matter.
A lot of straight leg raises, a lot of that.
Okay. Straight leg raises. How many sets are you prescribing of straight leg raises?
Good old 3 for
Okay.
10.
So if you get 3, then math tells us we need to be seeing them 4 days per week in order to get to 12 sets per week. So how many days a week are you seeing those athletes if they're doing 3 sets?
You have to see them at least 4.
I'm saying like so when you've seen them before,
Mm-hmm.
how many days a week were you working with them? Was it every day? Was it
It was
5
like
days a week?
5 days.
Yeah. So if you're doing 3 sets, 5 days a week, you're at 15 sets per week. So you're good in terms of the suggested amount. They suggest that you get at least 10 sets per week. And this was again from a strength and conditioning paper. This was referenced for a study that did less than 10 sets per week and more than 10 sets per week. It doesn't take a lot to do 10 sets per week. Again, you said the standard 3 sets and you're doing it 5 days a week, you're going to get to 15 easy. Where this gets a bit trickier is at the end stage. So if you're trying to increase hypertrophy even further, maybe now you need to get up to 15, 20, or even maybe it's more than that. There's there's a bodybuilding guy named Jeff Nippard who's got a YouTube channel who's really good. And he just put out a video that I saw that was, it was saying that it was up to, I think it was 54 sets per week or 44. I don't remember the exact number, but it was like 40 or 50 sets per week still continues to improve muscle hypertrophy compared to like 20 or 30 sets per week, which if you think about that, if you're trying to get to 50 sets per week, you're probably doing 10 sets per day for 5 days a week. Like that's a lot of volume. You're doing a lot of straight leg raises if that's the case. So some interesting implications there in terms of how you're actually going through and planning it out. But I think it kind of goes to show that there's no hard cap at how many reps or how many sets you should be doing. There, you need to have a rationale and you need to have a justification for why you're doing what you're doing. It doesn't always need to be 3 sets of 10. If you pick 3 sets of 10 as your kind of go-to or your fallback, at least know what you're doing. It's probably to build a decent like early stage volume of 10 plus sets per week. And it's probably going to be stimulating a little bit of strength, a little bit of muscle hypertrophy, but they're never really going to get powerful doing that. And they're not probably going to build enough muscle endurance doing that. So for early stage, do I mind 3 sets of 10? No. But if they're going to get closer to the end stage, I probably want to switch that up a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So then this brings us to the contraction type considerations. So this brings us back to the force. So the benefit of eccentric is typically that you can do a lot more work eccentrically than you can concentrically. For example, if I'm doing bench press, I can lower that bar with maybe 30% more than I can actually press back up on my own. And so you'll see a lot of times in strength training or in sometimes in a rehab context where you're doing only the eccentric portion. So for example, if I have a spotter who's holding the bar over me, I fight the bar all the way down to my chest and then they help me pick it back up so that it's doing less work because I can't just push that bar off my chest.
Mm-hmm.
So the benefit of eccentric is typically that you can load it up with more force and your muscles respond pretty well to the eccentric adaptations. Concentric, then, by contrast, is typically the lowest form of force output. Most people can't fight gravity all that well. And then isometric is somewhere in the middle of those two. So you can get pretty high forces with isometric depending on how you're telling them to contract. If it's yielding isometric versus overcoming isometric. There's all kinds of, again, nuance there where you can get more and more specific, but for the most part, all they were saying is that you should be getting a decent stimulus of all three of these types of contractions in an ACL rehab. And there's different parts of the rehab where each of those calls for different things. So for example, when you don't want to risk anything and you're trying to do relatively low forces early stage, maybe you want to start with concentric only. So you have them do like a trap bar deadlift, for example. You have them pick up the bar and then you just have them drop it when they get to the top of the lift. So then they're only getting the concentric portion. There's no eccentric lengthening of the muscle. There's no isometric holds at the bottom position. And then once they get better, once they're better able to tolerate a little bit of those forces, maybe now you want to start to play around with some isometrics and some eccentrics. The biomechanical considerations, they said they take a lot into consideration, but the paper basically only talked about open kinetic chain versus closed kinetic chain. And obviously we know there's a big difference there in terms of one, adaptations, but then two, like translation to a sport setting. Every sport that we currently play, well, let me take that back because swimming, I suppose, is not, but pretty much every competitive sport is played with gravity on the ground. So you need to graduate to a point of a closed kinetic chain at some point. Again, the early stage, maybe you're doing an open kinetic chain. End stage, you're probably doing closed kinetic chain. With the ACL specifically, obviously there's some implications there in terms of the graft security. You don't want to be doing a ton of open kinetic chain shearing forces early stage while that graft is still healing. So the ACL is a bit of a nuance, but for the most part, open kinetic chain is going to be easier than closed kinetic chain. You can get a lot more force applied through a closed kinetic chain. So that's typically reserved for later stages in a rehab process. Then the last piece that they talked about was the cross education. And so this involves using the contralateral limb to teach the involved limb. So if I tore my right ACL, I'm then going to use my left ACL, or I'm going to use my left leg to be doing the work, especially in early stages. So for example, in the first 8 weeks where I'm just working on inflammation, swelling, and range of motion, then I'm going to be doing a lot of strength work on my opposite side to then teach or re-educate my involved side. And what they saw was actually in the first 8 weeks after ACL reconstruction, there was a 28 to 31% increase in quad strength when they did the cross education compared to when they didn't. So that's a pretty significant contribution. Granted, I will say I think that it's probably a bit skewed, or like 28 to 31% probably sounds a lot higher than it really is, because the forces are so low. So if somebody's only able to generate 100 pounds of force, 128 versus 100 is probably not all that different. Now, if you had somebody that's generating 500 versus, let's say, what would it be, 600, then you start to see that's a pretty big jump there. So take it into consideration, but also recognize that it might be a little bit inflated or exaggerated based on the amount of force that's being put out.
And what would cross education look like? Like, what would be like a nice exercise for that?
Yeah, I mean, you could pick any exercise for it, but effectively what it would be. So if I tore my right ACL, I'm going to go on a leg press. I'm going to do a single leg press on just my left side so that my left leg is still getting stronger. And then it re-educates across. Basically, the concept is that it goes through the spinal cord, and then it's coming back out to the other side. So you still keep that neural pathway to be able to then recruit motor units in that injured side. So again, you can do any exercise if it's a single leg press, or maybe even you're doing a straight leg raise. Maybe you're doing left-sided straight leg raise to then re-educate your right side how to do it when it gets to that point. For an elbow, for example, or a shoulder, maybe you're doing dumbbell bench press, a single arm dumbbell bench press, because you can't bench press on your involved side yet. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So in summary, there are 1.5 million variables, and there's not really a hard science that says you need to do X amount of sets, X amount of reps, X amount of days per week. You just have to know what the variables are telling you and how you can kind of manipulate those to get the adaptations that you're trying to get, whether that is increased power or increased strength, increased hypertrophy, increased muscular endurance. If you're trying to work on those, then the rep scheme should more or less match it. And it doesn't have to be perfect. For example, you don't have to pick 30 reps every time you work on muscular endurance, but it should probably be more than 3 reps, for example. You're not going to get enough volume in that rep scheme to then match your training adaptation. The intensity, you should be working on force, or you measuring it via difficulty, and you're trying to pretty much always put out as much force as they can tolerate. That being said, you need to be considerate. If it's a immediate post-op, you need to be a little bit more careful with the forces that you're putting through them. But you should be gradually increasing that force throughout the rehab process as they get more and more able to tolerate it. The tempo you can play around with, but again, recognizing that those have different implications in terms of strength, power, hypertrophy, and then you can measure them if you want to. You can get a bit more specific with the velocity-based training. And then you can get really specific in terms of what you're trying, which adaptations you're trying to promote based on your velocity loss. The context is everything. So we didn't touch on this much, but the timing of the day, for example, if I'm doing a rehab, if I need them to be working on strength, but it's scheduled for the morning and they have training in the afternoon, then I'm not going to go like crazy heavy in the morning and have their legs like noodles, and then they have to go out and train. The training is still the priority. So I want to make sure that they're semi-fresh for that. Versus if they have training in the morning and then they have rehab in the afternoon, then you can push them a little bit harder in the afternoon because they can go home and sleep and recover, and then they come back the next day. The point in the season, so whether you are in off-season, pre-season, postseason, like depending on where you are, that should kind of drive some of your decisions. If you're going to push somebody for more strength, if you're going to push somebody for more hypertrophy, more muscular endurance, that kind of stuff. And those can all be periodized in, again, a million different ways. But then the article that I linked to from the NSCA is a good job breaking down the different types of periodization, when you might want to choose one strategy or the other, and then how you can apply it across the duration of a season with consideration to the different muscle fiber types or the different injuries, all of those kind of variables that we have to consider. And then lastly, you need to have consideration for the individual. So you can take internal metrics for it, so something like a heart rate, or you can measure their subjective experience, and you can say their RPE. You can have them rate pain via a visual analog scale, or you can have them do something like a wellness survey to measure their readiness to go for that next day. And then you can modify, again, you're using all of this information to then modify your variables. If you prescribe 3 sets of 10, 5 days a week, and you think that's a great setup, well, maybe you did too much intensity. Maybe you had 90% of their 1 rep max programmed and they did the workout, but then the next day they come back and they're not ready at all. They're super sore. Their joints are achy. Their muscles are sore. They can't move quite as fluidly. Their readiness scores are down. Their RPE is crazy high, and their visual analog score or scale is way up. Have consideration for the individual. It's not a perfect program if there's no individual consideration. So use the volume, intensity, tempo, and context to build the kind of meat and potatoes, but then you also need to season it with the individual. Any last questions?
Don't think so.
All right, you're an expert. So that wraps up tonight's meeting, and then next week will be exercise selection. So we'll dive into a little bit more depth in terms of which exercises are you going to choose for maybe different rehabs, different gym applications, different points in their rehab, different sports even. We can discuss kind of a million different directions with exercise selection. So again, kind of strength and conditioning with soft science, but you get some guidance and some implications that you can then use your clinical reasoning to decide which exercise you want to program, which one you don't.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you for being here as always, and hopefully we will see you again next week.